Hi.
Hello. Ray Franz goes in more deeply to the character and nature of the unfaithful slave in the last portion of his chapter in Search of Christian Freedom, his chapter entitled The Faithful and Discreet Slave. He starts off with the parable again, back to the parable. So we'll read starting on page 177.
In the case of the parable, it is evident that someone blew the whistle on the arrogant slave, so that the master knew what had happened during his absence. It is, then, not a beating of a fellow servant, if another of the master's servants calls attention to the unfaithful conduct of that particular servant, bears testimony to the wrongness of his acts in dealing with other servants of the household. Instead, if done with a proper motive, it reflects concern for others and their welfare, represents a just and proper effort to bring about a redressing of the wrong, a correcting of an unjust situation.
The beating in the parable is very different from this. It is the case of one who has or considers himself as having a superior position and who uses it in dominating others as inferiors. He acts as if he can do this with impunity, as though there will be no day of reckoning for him, no accounting for such superior cavalier treatment of others, of those whom he was supposed to feed humbly and faithfully. He acts as if whatever he does, even if wrong, doubtless even the serving of adulterated food, will be excused or overlooked by the master. Such a person, having that view in spirit, would feel that no one should ever register complaint, and that any doing so should be treated as showing disrespect to his appointed authority, and hence worthy of punishment, deserving a beating by him. I think that any reflection and meditation on this will convince us that there are many examples of this today, and in many religions.
The unfaithful slave is spoken of as eating and drinking with drunkards. In the Bible, drunkenness is often used in a figurative sense, apart from literal intoxication. Some men are literally drunken brawlers, but one can be figuratively drunk in a number of ways. The prophet Isaiah figuratively depicts as drunken religious leaders of ancient Israel, men whom he described as braggarts, self-confident men who tyrannized over others, but who felt secure in their immunity to any adverse judgment from God.
One can thus become drunk with power, with self-importance. Along with literal drunkenness, the unfaithful slave showed himself intoxicated with his own authority by his dominating treatment of those he was supposed to serve. This is a common failing of those who attain positions of authority and of power. It is a trap that can be avoided only by constant conscious effort. That is true of individuals. It is also true of organizations.
As has been demonstrated, the problem as a whole lies not so much with the Watchtower organization's insistence on restricting all application of the parable to a class. It lies primarily with the way the parable is used to enforce the control of an authority structure as a means of intimidation, suppressing any conscientious objection to the dictates and declarations of what amounts to an elite group, as also it uses to robe those dictates and declarations with divine force, whether they are in harmony with actual scriptural statements or not. To use the parable in this manner is to do violence to its basic theme of considerately, humbly, responsibly, and faithfully serving the needs of others as fellow servants of one's master.
The parable should induce serious, heart-searching self-examination. Any self-assured posture, any authoritarian attitude, or flaunting of one's claimed superior position, any inclination to take punitive action toward those not conforming to one's own will or viewpoint, is surely an evidence of a delaying of the day of accounting in one's own heart. Back in the 1st century, Diotrephes displayed such an attitude by his actions, domineering over others in the congregation, expelling those whom he viewed as a threat to his authority. And by the way, that's based on 3 John verses 9 to 11.
And John was the one that he thought was needing to be expelled.
Yeah, he was expelling a member of the governing body from his local congregation.
Down through the centuries, many individuals, religious leaders, and organizations have exemplified that pattern, insisting that persons line up with their concepts or dogma, or else be hit with accusations of spiritual insubordination, willful and egotistical independence, disloyalty to God and Christ, hence needing to be thrown out of the household of God. Religious history is replete with such examples. To follow their course today is, in effect, to fellowship with such men, eating and drinking with the drunkards. Those who, like the religious drunkards of ancient Israel, are intoxicated with their own importance.
By contrast, others, though themselves wrongly accused and cast out, though scattered about and perhaps limited in fellowship to a few companions, may have nonetheless kept their place by never losing sight of their personal relationship and accountability to their master. Within whatever sphere of influence God grants them, however small, they rightly view their stewardship not as a power base or as a means of intimidating others, but as an opportunity and obligation to serve others in the spirit of their compassionate master. In his own time and on a person-by-person basis, he promises to make evident who got the point of his parable and applied it, and who did not. Well, we might take exception to a generalization that you kind of read between the lines and the paragraphs here as to this being commonplace in Christendom.
Yeah. Because he says replete in history with these kinds of examples. But it hasn't been our experience in the churches that we've attended or the denominations that we know of that they even have the teeth to do this kind of stuff, because they're not like the Watchtower, authoritarian in that they have such control over the people.
Yeah. We have made the case, if you've seen any of the videos we did on Luke and on Hebrews back a few months back, that Christendom has the opposite problem from the Watchtower.
Yeah.
It has no teeth to bite with.
Yeah.
At least they have the doctrine of eternal punishment, Armageddon, in the Watchtower. The old turn the hose on hell criticism of Russell's day, where he at least discerned that many churches had the power of hell to hold people over.
Yeah.
But that's not true anymore. Very few churches that I know of have this kind of grip or control over their membership.
Yeah.
It is true, though, there are abusive churches. So I agree with Ray there. I just don't think he had enough experience to see that the generalizations here just generally don't hold when it comes to mainstream
and
denominations.
it's not even just from churches we attended, because at one point I was a church secretary and I met dozens of ministers. And these men, you could tell from speaking with them, genuinely were concerned for the people, you know, for the sheep that they had under their care. As
we said at the end of the last segment, there is a point here that jumped out at us as we got to the end of the Ray's chapter on the faithful and discreet slave. Namely, he's judging them more by their character, specifically their abusive character.
Right.
Whereas it is true that many Jehovah's Witnesses get into the funk, spiritual funk, criticizing the messenger rather than the message. There seems to be an awful lot of witnesses, ex-witnesses out there who still believe the basic message of the Watchtower.
Just don't like the way they've been treated or other people have been treated.
But really, it's about the message more than the messenger. So we wanted to end this section of In Search of Christian Freedom with a reading from a chapter that made a big difference to us, and that's Hebrews chapter 12.
Were you going to show them the...
Yeah, I'll contrast this, which many of you will remember. This was the book we used for public ministry. Contrast the end of this book with what you read here in Hebrews chapter 12.
All right, so verses 1 to 3. So then, because we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also put off every weight and the sin that easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, as we look intently at the chief agent and the perfecter of our faith, Jesus. For the joy that was set before him, he endured a torture stake, despising shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Indeed, consider closely the one who has endured such contrary talk by sinners against their own interest, that you may not get tired and give out in your souls.
So who should we consider closely? And when we think of the one we should consider closely, what should we think of about him?
And setting our eyes intently on Christ.
But not Christ, CEO of God's heavenly organization, or Christ in a manger, as the Watchtower rightly criticizes Christendom for being hung up on the baby Jesus. Well, yes, they are and they aren't. Baby Jesus definitely is a Christmas preoccupation, but not at Easter.
Yeah.
It's Christ crucified. That's exactly where your eyes should be, according to Hebrews 12, which you might remember follows up Hebrews 11, the Hall of Fame of faith. If we're going to have the faith of the Hall of Fame listed for us in Hebrews 11, how are we going to get that faith? Well, in here he says it's by considering closely Jesus, but not Jesus CEO or Jesus' invisible presence, where he's hiding behind an organization that you need to be in contact with. Christ himself, but Christ crucified, impaled, yes. But in almost all Bibles other than the Watchtower's Bible, it's Christ crucified. And you might remember, that is also the gospel that Paul brags about himself preaching in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, when he says he preaches Christ and him crucified. This is the center of the gospel.
Right.
And it always has been so if you've looked at the creeds of the church. But here's our gospel that we preached in the 1980s, and it was, of course, not changed from the 1930s. You can live forever in paradise on earth. This is our gospel, and in case you needed to underline it, here's the last page of this book, which apparently was published in the millions, i.e. over 40 million copies of this book in, of course, dozens of languages. And there's the picture they want you to paint for the audiences out there.
What you should be thinking about, this woman is thinking about. Paradise Earth.
You should be thinking about life in paradise. The caption right beside her face is keep God's new system bright in your mind and heart.
Yeah.
There's nothing about paradise earth in any of these passages.
No.
Nothing about paradise earth in the book of Acts. Nothing about paradise earth anywhere but in the Old Testament.
So it's really a very selfish center in the minds of witnesses, and I must say that was the thing that I thought about mostly, was paradise earth, that was my future. But where is Christ and God in that? They're kind of in the distant always.
And if you want more info on what happens to the paradise earth that is in the Old Testament, well, check out our video series, Who Really Are Jehovah's Witnesses, where in there Vivian reads all of the famous Watchtower Paradise passages consecutively over a dozen or so videos or more.
Yeah.
And then there's another series called Paradise Lost, where we analyze many of the more familiar paradise passages from the prophets, etc.
I was just going to mention, for many ex-witnesses, you may not have had bad relationships with individual witnesses. You may have found them to be loving people, and the elders to be lovable guys. But regardless of that, if the message is wrong, we have to reconsider here.
Gladly, I'm going into the next chapter. We're going to read the next chapter, chapter 6 of Ray Franz's book, which is Salvation by Faith, Not Works, based upon Ephesians chapter 2, 8 and 9, which says, By this undeserved kindness, indeed you have been saved through faith. And this is not owing to you, it is God's gift. No, it is not owing to works, in order that no man should have ground for boasting. So that's the next chapter of In Search of Christian Freedom.